we are very lucky to have with us an economist with a very diverse experience. She's an economist who has been in the White House. That's not an easy place to get into, believe me. And now she works for Amazon. So that's a different side of the world. We have with us Aparna Mathur. Let's listen to her. Over to you, Aparna.
Thank you, Subodh. Such a pleasure to be here. This is a really unique, I think, setting as you describe, just talking a lot about myself and my journey, and I hope it's useful to the people who are listening. I come from India. I am currently based in the US. As Subodh said, I've been working at the White House for a while and now at Amazon, but my journey started in actually Lucknow, and before that was Muzaffarnagar. My dad, Yogendra Ryan, was in the IAS and was, moving between different cities. I was born in Muzaffarnagar in Uttar Pradesh, India. Studied in Loreto Convent in Lucknow, and then came to Delhi, where I did the rest of my schooling at Delhi Public School, Arkepuram. I got interested in economics. I remember in 1991, I was still in high school, and started sort of following the news about India's balance of payments crisis, and was getting into reading newspapers and trying to understand the world. And it was fascinating to me how real it felt, right? Like every day you were hearing about things like unemployment and how is the economy going to respond, and oh my goodness, how foreign exchange reserves are so limited. We only have like 2 months of money to pay for imports and things. And that really, it stuck with me. I was like, this is a macro issue and it's impacting all of us in our day-to-day lives. Everyone's reading about it, and there were consequences to that, right? Like the government changes and liberalization and all of the stuff that came after that. So it really piqued my interest in economics. And when I applied, I did economics in high school in my 11th and 12th grades. And then I also applied and got into Hindu college to do a BA in economics. And for some reason, the subject really stays with me even today. I think the way people think about economics today is that it's very closely tied to finance, right? It's about if I'm in a cab in DC and somebody, the cab driver thinks I'm an economist, they'll say, well, what do you think about Wall Street? And what do you think about stocks? And, where is all of that headed? I'm like, that's not the kind of economics I do, right? Like I'm not a finance person, but I do care about the average person. How do government policies impact them? How does, how do changes in the labor market impact the average person? What's happening to wages? What's happening to people's ability to find jobs? So that, that piece of it that's so real and that actually touches people's lives is what really got me very heavily interested in economics and also in policy making. So anyway, I did my undergrad in economics from Hindu, went to do my master's at Delhi School of Economics. And then I actually had, I would say, like 16 years of straight schooling and said, what the heck, I want to try something different. I don't want to be, continue to study. So actually, between Hindu and Delhi school, I took a year off and I said, I just want to go work in the corporate sector. And a part of it was also influenced by my oldest brother, who got into IIM Lucknow. And, he was trying out the MBA program. And I was like, that sounds fascinating. Maybe I want to go do something in the corporate sector. I applied for CAD, didn't get in. And then I was like, okay, I don't know really what I want to do. So I said, I'll just go work directly and see what that experience feels like. So I worked at a computer consulting firm, dealt with clients, understood a lot about the business. And then, I kept getting pulled back into research. I was like, no, actually, this is not for me, right? Like, I want to study more. I want to learn more. And that's what pushed me to applying for Delhi School of Economics, where I was lucky to get in, had 2 years of super intense, econ teaching blew my mind. I was like, there's all this abstract theoretical concepts in math and macro and things, but got through it, applied for a PhD in the US, and came to the University of Maryland at College Park. I think I was lucky coming to UMD because there had been, through Dr. Arvind Panagaria, there were connections between the Delhi School of Economics and the College Park program. And so I had like a natural, community to come to. Also, my brother, my middle brother, was also studying at University of Maryland at that time. So that transition was easier for me. I think it wasn't as easy for a lot of other students who come to the US and have no connections, but I feel like we built up a nice, student community of Indians in the US. And, now I still tell my kids, look, we used to pick up, mattresses that were lying at dumpsters, in those student housing, and they were all clean and nice. It was just people who were moving out, and it was understood that that's where you found your next object for your apartment. But I still feel like, we never, like, the standard of living was very decent. I coming in to a study program and being able to afford rent your own apartment, that already had like a microwave and fridges and a carpeted, flooring. I was like, that's pretty decent, right? Like, I'm only paying I don't know, $300, $400 a month. And obviously we were sharing, but you could still afford a pretty decent standard of living. And yes, we were not splurging on, eating out a lot, but I love those days, right? Like you had a limited budget, and your main focus was studies. And the campuses in the US, frankly, are amazing, right? Like you just feel that desire to research and learn, and you feel like there's a lot of opportunity to improve and focus on the work. So I loved my graduate years at University of Maryland. And finished my PhD. During my time there, I think a lot of us came to the US saying, we want to do trade or macro. I came in saying, I want to do environmental economics. But then, I realized that I had different interests. And so I actually specialized in macro and international finance during my PhD, which is surprising to me today because I don't really view myself as a macroeconomist. But again, I think it was driven by what I saw happening in India in 1991, right? Like it was a macro economic crisis. And I always felt like, oh, what can I do to think about issues like that? And what would I do if I were in that situation? How should the country respond? And so that drew me to macro, and I loved the coursework. But I ended up working with, like household level survey data. I ended up doing a lot of work that was empirical, and, and I just like the ability to see thousands of observations that related to real people. You just start seeing patterns in the work, and I really, really enjoyed that. I felt like, that was my true sort of calling, just being able to analyze data and understand where interesting research questions might come from. I ended up doing my PhD in a topic on small businesses. And, I kind of said, look, in the US, there's a lot of variation in bankruptcy regulations across states. And how does that actually drive entrepreneurship, right? And it was just like deep diving that for 2 to 3 years. I realized how much, like, the US in itself is super different from, European countries. Like in the US, there's this culture of a startup, right? Like you can fail, and there's entrepreneurship, people are entrepreneurial and they fail and they come back, and they fail and they come back. And there's the serial entrepreneur who's always experimenting. And you actually value those people, right? Like you say, oh, wow, I mean, that's amazing, right? Like you have an idea, you tried it, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And if it works, you become like you've added something to the world that's super valuable. But if you haven't, you're still trying hard. And so if you look at, bankruptcy rules in the US, they're very they do favor the small business owner, to a large extent. Like they'll say, your debts are forgiven under certain bankruptcy rules. Your debts are forgiven. Your personal assets will not be touched
Right.
when you file for bankruptcy, and that gives them that protection to say, okay, I can fail, and I can come back, because it's not like I still have what I started out with. If you look at a lot of European countries, the culture is very different. Like a failure is viewed as a disgraceful thing.
Right.
And, you have to repay your debts, and that could take you years or decades. And the debt sort of rolls over onto your family. And so it was really interesting to me to see how even a country's philosophy is embodied in the kinds of laws and regulations that you see. So I love that work. I even got the Small Business Administration in the US, randomly sent out an email to all the PhD students saying, look, we're looking for research on small businesses, and you can apply for this funding if you are doing that research. And I was like, I'm never going to get it, but I applied and, got a pretty hefty scholarship from them, which was very useful in the final 2 years, because we were applying for jobs, and applications cost money. And so I was really grateful to have that, on top of having sort of the support from the SBA Office of Advocacy. And the people were really nice, and they really loved the work that I was doing. And that's one of the things I really loved about the US system too. The opportunities that kind of opened up for me, right? Like, just because you're a student doesn't mean that you don't have something valuable to say. Just because you're a student doesn't mean that, you're like, no one's gonna care about what you're saying till you become like this professional, that people do need to listen to. So after that, I applied and got into this think tank in DC called the American Enterprise Institute. And at that time, honestly, I'm not a political person by nature. I have no idea, what AEI is, honestly, philosophy was, or politics was, is it conservative, liberal? So I applied, and, when I went for the interview, it was just so research focused. They loved the work that I was doing. I had really great, meetings with everyone I met that day, and got the job offer the very same day. And I was like, oh, this is, incredible. It's in DC. Secondly, it gave me the opportunity to work on policy. And third, it allowed me to continue with my research. And so I took up the job. I had no idea what would come off it. I had never thought about think tanks as, the important role that think tanks can play in policy making, right? I had worked at think tanks in Delhi. I actually worked at the Tata Energy Research Institute one summer, where I did some research on climate policy. I had, even during the PhD, I actually worked at the World Bank one summer. I did an internship, with the Development Economics Prospects Group, but, not much exposure to think tanks in DC at all. So I was really surprised. So the first thing I ended up working on was looking at, I saw this research paper that came out of Harvard Medical School. I didn't know at that time who Elizabeth Warren was, right?
Yes.
But it was a paper by her and, a couple of co-authors that said something like, I think a very large fraction, something like 60% of bankruptcies in the US are due to medical reasons.
Okay.
And for some reason, as an economist, I'm so skeptical of like this one factor that causes, a very large impact on, one thing. I was like, how can that be true, right? Like, if 60% of bankruptcies were due to medical reasons, like, this would be a way bigger deal. All of us would know that, medical deaths were such a big problem, and, people were filing bankruptcies left, right, and center because they had, these high levels of medical bills. So I said, okay, I had time. And AI is amazing in the sense that, there's no set research agenda. So I'll talk a lot about AI because I was really surprised at sort of the academic freedom I had, the ability to work across different policy areas. As a scholar, you have complete freedom to dive deep into any topic that's of interest. There's no party line of this is how the think tank, views this position. And so let's, don't deviate from that. That never happened at AEI. You literally had the ability to, take on any project anytime you wanted. And it was your own reputation at stake, right? Like it's a very public facing think tank. Anything you put out is going out, the media is free to cover it. It's going out to policymakers. So you were always on the hook. And, I think we all sort of set that high bar for ourselves that, I always said, look, if I do research, I'm going to imagine that every paper I put out, I'm sending to an academic journal, right? Like that's my training as a PhD. And I'm not going to put out stuff that is sloppy or isn't fact checked and wouldn't meet the standards of like an actual publication. So I said, okay, let me look at this. If I needed to, I said, I'll deep dive, I'll work with a different survey data than they had. And let me see if I come up with the same result. And so I did my own research and, basically wrote up a paper saying, look, these numbers sound very exaggerated. And, if you look at how much medical debt, is, at the far end, at the top end, likely to result in bankruptcy, it's probably something like, 10 to 15%, but not 60% and not, the high numbers that they were stating. And then I also went through their paper and I said, look, here are the issues that I see with their paper, because there's a lot of selection bias, like you're interviewing people who have already filed for bankruptcy. And yet if they happen to have any, medical bills on their credit card or, that they stated that they had, then they were classified as a medical debtor. So there was like an overly, expansive definition of, who is a medical debtor and who's not. Things like, if 2 years ago you had taken like a week off because you were sick, you were considered a medical debtor. So there were just like a lot of things that stood out to me that didn't make sense to me. And so I kind of wrote that up as part of the, the paper I put out. And the next thing I know, I got a call from someone in, the Senate Judiciary Committee saying, oh, would you come and testify in Congress on, on this paper, because it's now becoming like a thing that politicians are using to pitch, their own particular programs. And I think at that time it was something around universal healthcare, right? Like if everybody's facing high medical debt, your solution is let's give everybody subsidized healthcare. So I suppose it was fascinating. Like as a first year post PhD, I did like 4 testimonies on the Hill on just this topic. And I'm, even if I had watched testimonies before, I could not imagine that things like, selection bias and all of that, we were debating because it wasn't Elizabeth Warren on the panel, but her co-authors. So it became like a very academic, like, I don't agree with this. And here's where the bias comes in. But it was an amazing experience, right? Like you're testifying in front of a whole committee and, and you just, you stick to your guts around like, this is what I know, right? Like I'm not here to prove anyone's political agenda, but if you give this to me as an academic paper, here are all my issues with it. And so I ended up doing a ton of, sort of testimonies and, writing around that. And I think testimonies are fascinating because you're very much on the spot, right? Like politicians are asking you things that, you need to be able to think on your feet and respond to right away. And they're not asking academic questions, right? They're thinking big. They think about the country. They think about larger questions. And so like I was actually very happy with the way it all played out because I was very nervous going in, right? Like I had no expertise in doing this stuff. But I think what was amazing about AEI was that they were confident in putting me there, right? Like any other place may have said, look, you're so new, you wouldn't know how to handle a committee. And my director, Kevin Hassett, I give him so much credit because he was always like, no, you can do this, I'll help you here, you write, you have to submit a written testimony. So he read that through and I wrote it. And then it gave me the confidence to say, it's almost like, okay, I'm standing in front of a PhD committee and I'm defending what I wrote, right? And so it was, I've always sort of said, well, if I've gone through that, if I've gone through, presenting at seminars and having academics, hurl questions at me, I can take this. But it was an amazing learning experience. And I did a lot of that at AEI over time, because you're like, I wrote a lot of pieces on income inequality. I ended up working on a ton of policy areas that seemed to be of relevance to, politically and policy-wise. And so I ended up doing a ton of testimonies. And that's what was amazing about AEI. Like, I think think tanks in DC play a really important role, especially places like the American Enterprise Institute and Brookings, that are viewed as being, on opposing ends of the political spectrum. I think AEI is more conservative, Brookings maybe more liberal. But I think what's valuable is that they both, there's a ton of academic freedom. There isn't this political diktat of here's what you have to say, and so we're very center, even if there are leanings, I think we're more center right and center left. And that's why people come to us and view us as, yes, here's an impartial, unbiased view of the state of the world. And yes, maybe there are some leanings here and there, but it's always backed by data and evidence and facts, right? Like, I'm not going to put out an opinion piece that is not backed by, something I believe, like I have dug up in the data. And so I think my PhD training, really played a role there, where I was, even if I write an op-ed today, I still feel like I don't just want to say, oh, this is what I believe, right? Like, no, here's the data. Here's why I think the way I do. And I think in a place like DC, that becomes more and more valuable over time, because you realize that people are putting out pieces that are not always, substantive, that are not always driven by facts. In fact, it's a lot driven by ideology. And so if you can come in and say, well, show me why you're saying what you do, right? Give me the opportunity to work with your data if you have any, and, maybe I'll agree with you, right? Like, if at the end of that, I realize I was mistaken in the way I'm thinking about this, I'm open to changing my mind. And I think we just need a lot of that in DC. And one, amazing example, actually two amazing things also that happened. We looked, one of the first sort of bigger research papers that I worked on was looking at the incidence of the corporate income tax on workers.
Yeah.
And, it's such an interesting question. I think in economics, in public finance, people, always said, look, if corporate tax rates are high and investment falls, there's likely to be some impact on factors of production like workers, right?
Right.
Empirically, there had been no research papers on that, which is like amazing to me, because that almost never happens now in economics. Like, everyone's dug into everything you feel. But when I came to AEI, politically, there's a big debate about, should we raise the corporate income tax, right? Like, Democrats are all for, we should have really high corporate tax rates because it's the rich, CEOs and shareholders who need to pay for because they have higher incomes. And I think Republicans, being sort of a relatively pro-business party, have always said, no, we need, lower corporate tax rates, and that spurs investment. And so, I said, look, I don't care about the politics, but I will dig into this research question, right? Like, who actually in practice bears the incidence of the corporate income tax, right? On the one hand, it's being applied to a corporation, but a company is just a company, right? Like, ultimately, it's consumers, shareholders, and workers. And so across these three, like, where are the costs being passed on to? So Kevin Hassett and I wrote the very first paper, honestly, Subodh, on corporate tax incidence. And I remember spending months, like, pulling the data together. We did a cross-country analysis where we pulled data from over 100 countries. We built a whole tax database, which, we would share, like, with anybody who wanted it, because that had never been done before. But we built a whole corporate tax database where we pulled in corporate tax information from every country. I also built up using, I think, ILO data on worker wages, and, wrote up a regression model and said, look, higher corporate tax rates are correlated with, or actually are causal in lowering worker wages. And we think the mechanism is through lower investment, right? Like if you have companies facing high corporate tax rates, there's an incentive to, at least on the intensive margin, like not invest as much. And then that, if workers have lower capital to work with, that leads to lower wages. And I wrote that up, and we started sort of sharing that paper, and it just became such, it created such a flutter because, on the one hand, it's coming out of AEI, so everyone's like, oh, the reason you're writing this paper is because you want lower corporate taxes, and now you're trying to say, look, this is about workers. And so it's a really nice connection to make, that, look, it's not the rich CEO who's paying out of his pocket, for these higher corporate taxes. It's actually the average worker in manufacturing who's paying for it. And so we started getting a lot of, pushback, like there must be something wrong, there's something wrong with the empirical analysis, like these results don't make sense. So we had to, we created data that we could share. We sent everything out. I remember the Congressional Research Service reached out and said, we want to analyze the work you've done. Send us your actual code and do files and regressions that you ran and everything. So we shared everything. And, people were like, yes, the results hold, but it's just like it wasn't like people didn't want to believe that the effects could be very large.
Yeah.
And The Economist actually reached out and wrote up a whole, column on our paper saying, look, this is one of the first papers. They still cite it. It's amazing to me. They still cite it. And every time they write about corporate tax incidents, I still see our paper being cited because it was literally the first. And I spent a lot of nervous, days and nights just sort of saying, well, what have I done wrong, right? Like, have I, pulled the wrong data? Am I, making the right adjustments? Am I controlling for the right things? Because it was just, it's really hard to be the first one to write a paper because you can't sort of back up and say, oh, I'm following the model that this person did. Right? It's always on you. Right. And so we were under a lot of scrutiny, but eventually what happened was that a lot of other economists, academic economists, started writing, they worked with different data sets and they started writing up the research papers, and also came back with the finding that, yes, we also find that, higher corporate tax rates lead to lower wages. Now, the magnitude of the impact is different because they're looking at different settings and different countries and, different years, but at least it was a giant relief to us that, the results were being replicated to some extent. So that was, I love that we could actually push thinking on, on such an important topic. And what happened with that was that when, President Trump came into office in 2017, that kind of became like a paper that started getting circulated a lot because they said, well, here's why we need corporate tax reform. And what's interesting, Subodh, is that even before, President Trump came in, there were academic economists on both sides who were saying, look, the US is one of the countries is a country with one of the highest corporate tax rates in the world. And that's obviously not good for us, right? Like we don't want our businesses to, move offshore. We don't want investment to go down. So we do need rate reductions. So there was alignment. I think the only difference was like how much of a rate cut are we asking for, right? And I think Democrats, the US at that time had like a 35% federal corporate tax rate. And Democrats were saying, well, we should go down to 26 or 27. When Donald Trump came in, he said, I'm going down to 21. And that's where, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, lowered corporate tax rates to like 21%, which was like a major, major change, a major overhauling of the tax system. But our paper became one of the papers that was regularly cited at that time. And I remember doing like a ton of media and, things around because everyone was like, where is this idea coming from? Right? Like we keep saying that corporate taxes are good for workers. Where is this idea coming from? And at that time, we could cite our paper and also a bunch of other papers that had come out that, was still doing that. And finally, the other thing I really want to touch on is the work I did around paid family and medical leave. So again, looking at the country, I said, one issue I really want to work on is economic opportunity for low-wage workers, right? Like, what are we doing? What policies are we adopting that make lives better and create opportunity, right? Like what America is known for, right? So someone who's coming from, I think of myself, like I wasn't poor in India, that's not what I mean, but I came here as a student, right? I was earning my tuition from, luckily my tuition was paid for and I was getting a stipend of, I think, $1,000 a month. And we lived on that. And we went from that to like getting, good jobs in DC. And then, now I'm at Amazon. My husband is at PwC. He's also from India. And so I was thinking of my own journey. I was like, what opportunities did I get? And what opportunities should we think about, providing for people who are low income in the US that make that path possible, right? And so it's things like schooling and access to, good schools and good teachers and a good social network and the ability to, find jobs and things like that. So I wrote a lot about that. And as part of that, I also started looking specifically at women's economic opportunity and realized that the US is one of the few countries that actually doesn't have a federal paid parental leave policy on the books. So what the US has is unpaid family and medical leave that says that if you have a child, you can take a certain number of weeks off, but it's going to be unpaid.
Right.
And that's a real challenge for low-wage workers, right? Like it's okay for us because our companies and our, savings, honestly, can allow us to take whatever time off we need when we have when we give birth or when, we have a medical issue, but that's not an option for a lot of low-wage workers. And so if you start reading, research from Pew and other places, they say that a lot of women are going back to work, within 2 weeks of having a child because they literally cannot afford to stay home, right? And you lose your hourly job if you're not showing up for work. And so if you don't actually enforce paid parental leave, you're not going to, really improve the lives of those workers. You can do it doesn't really matter for middle and higher income people. And so I wrote a research paper on that saying, look, we have a lot of programs in the US, like the child tax credit and the earned income tax credit, that are geared towards providing, government support, cash supports to families with children. What if we could combine all of that and, create like a lump sum cash amount that families could access in the year that they give birth, right? Like say an advance payment sort of coming to you because you know that you're going to get that at the end of the year, but it may not align with when you actually have your child. So I wrote that piece, and surprisingly, the Melinda Gates Foundation reached out, Pivotal Ventures, and said, we love the work you're doing on paid parental leave. And honestly, I think a part of it was that conservatives hadn't ever, like a place like AEI had never written about something like paid leave. Because the thinking is, look, if it's a new government program, we're not going to get into that. Like, we don't want more government spending. And so the fact that I kind of said, look, there are existing government programs, and maybe you could, expand on these programs themselves in order to create, more cash supports for families with children. So I think that intrigued them, and they were like, would you run a working group, that could explore this policy further? And so I started a working group that involved people from Brookings. My co-director for the Paid Leave Project was Isabel Sahel at Brookings. But we involved a lot of really good academics and policy people who had served in different administrations, because the whole purpose was to make it kind of bipartisan, right? Like we want to hear from both sides, but we also want to hear from both sides who have thought a lot about it, who are open to, new information and knowledge, and to come across as like this is a substantive research and policy effort into doing something that we want to move the needle on. And the understanding always was like, look, if we don't agree on something, that's fine too. The foundation was never said, look, here's what you need to come out with, right? So we always said, you need to be hands off after you give us the money. And whatever the group finds is what we're going to report out. And to their credit, that's exactly how it played out. And I remember at the end of that, coming out with the report from the working group that said, look, we think the US should have a federal, paid parental leave program. And you can fund it through a slightly higher payroll tax, but also, you can also create efficiencies in existing government programs. And here's where the money comes from. And that works both was also so well received. At that time, Ivanka Trump was in the White House, and her team was also doing a lot of work on paid leave policies. And so we got invited to the White House to present our research. And, ended up, I think, opening a lot of people's minds to the idea that, look, don't think of paid leave as another middle class entitlement, right? Like the fact that paid leave doesn't exist is actually the worst for the lowest wage workers. And so we had these distributional charts saying, here's, who's actually getting impacted by the lack of this policy in the US. And so even amongst Republicans, I have to say, like we had so many meetings with their staffers, and they were like, actually, it's great that you're thinking about this. We really want to do more for, lower wage workers. We don't need to, yes, we worry about spending more on people who already have the money, but this, if we can figure out a more targeted approach that's more geared towards that population, we're on board. And so just around, 2018, 2019, you'll notice that there were a lot of Republican paid leave proposals, which was something that had never happened before. I'm not taking credit. I'm not saying the A.I. Brookings working group is the sole reason for that. But we definitely, I think, played a role. The report got a lot of coverage in the New York Times, everywhere, because it was the first sort of effort outside, I think, government for people who actually advise on policy, right, to come together and say, look, we do agree with this. We think it's a problem that the US doesn't have this, and here are some suggestions for how you could implement such a policy. So that was also amazing to me that, being outside government, you could bring about, change in thinking that, you don't vilify one side or the other, but you figure out a compromise, right? Like within the working group, there were a lot of differences in how people came to the subject. And we spent a year sort of figuring out, okay, where is their alignment? Is there alignment? What are areas of disagreement and agreement? And then came up with what we thought was a compromise proposal, because not everyone was happy with it, right? Like some people wanted even more generous leave, some people wanted even fewer weeks of leave. So I loved that process. I learned a lot from that, because as long as people are intellectually honest and willing to engage, I think you can make a ton of progress. So that was AEI. And then when the pandemic hit, I was asked by Kevin Hassett and some other people who I'd worked with before were at the White House, helping out during the epidemic. And, they needed more staffers, they needed more economists, because obviously it was a huge crisis. And the CA staff, surprisingly, is very tiny. It's like 12 to 13 senior economists and another 12 to 13 junior economists. But there's so much data, even when, it's non-COVID times, right? Like there's a ton of memos and policy work that has to happen. So during the pandemic, I loved the job. I went in, we were required to go in every day, even though the world was sort of, in shutdown mode. I think we went into the Council of Economic Advisors every day from, I remember going 7 a.m. to, 8 p.m, because everything was happening simultaneously, right? Like decisions around, like, how is the economy going to improve, where is the virus headed? We were working with FEMA, with epidemiologists, trying to say, here's the course of the virus, here's where the economy is going to hit next, here's where state lockdowns are happening. So many decisions to be made continuously, but amazing time as a researcher to be at the forefront of that policy making, right? In the first few months were just like, not sort of economic policies, but really like tracking the economy, tracking health data, figuring out like where should allocations of resources go, like masks and gloves and, things like that. And then as the first few months after the pandemic, the focus was on government stimulus programs, right? Like, what do we do to help the economy come back, right? What should unemployment compensation look like? What should small business supports look like? So we did a lot of, research and work around that. And it's interesting. So it got me thinking about the safety net as a whole. And I started, when I came out of CEA in May 2022, May 2021, sorry, I, applied to the Harvard Kennedy School, Mathur Rahmani Center for Business and Government, because I said, I really want to sit back. I want to take a year to research how the US social safety net actually works, because we did so much during the pandemic that didn't rely on the traditional safety net, right? Like the traditional safety net is you get about $250 a week from unemployment compensation, and then you have food stamps and other programs. But during the pandemic, we created like a $600 supplement per week for unemployment insurance. We created the Paycheck Protection Program, which is a completely new small business program that had never existed before. And, it helped businesses survive the pandemic. There were just so many new programs that came in. So I said, I want to look at not only the new programs, but also how does the traditional safety net actually work? And so part of my research that's happening now with the Kennedy School, Harvard Kennedy School, is on how does the traditional safety net work? Where are there gaps? How can we, come up with policies that help address that? And that's been fascinating and interesting to me. But that research arose from my time at the White House.
Right.
And I'm also employed at Amazon. Amazon also reached out around when I was leaving CEA. Amazon is unique in that it's become such a huge employer of people in the United States. Like the hourly workforce in the US is, I think we're at like 800,000 people. And overall, if you include corporate, it's over 1 million. I think it's about 1.2 million people. So we're one of the largest employers in the US. And one of Amazon's leadership principles is to strive to be Earth's best employer. And that's where my team comes in. So my team was started by an economist named Justine Hastings. She's a former professor from Brown University, who initially came to Amazon as a part-time scholar and then decided, to stay on. She's now the VP, and she started a new team that is very focused on, I would say, like labor-focused research, right? We hired a bunch of economists who look at the challenges that are facing the hourly workforce, within Amazon, and hopefully with ripple effects throughout the U.S. economy. And we look broadly at things like career growth and career pathing and wages and benefits, and what could we be doing more? What policies can we adopt? What research can we do to help improve the lives of Amazonians? So it's it sounds like, how could you be in the corporate sector? Like, what is the role that economists can play? I think economists can play a super interesting role because a lot of these big companies are also employers of, the work people that we care about. The ideas around improving economic opportunity, the ideas around how can we improve people's lives, what programs should they access, what supports can we provide? Those translate very neatly into a setting where you can also have immediate impact, right? Like if we write a nice data-driven report that says, here are the challenges within our workforce, here's a solution, here's a possible evaluation of that solution. It's so data-driven, it's so science-driven that when it goes up to Amazon's board or it goes up to Andy Jassy, we can actually bring about change. So that's the piece that's very attractive to me about working at Amazon, is the ability to change people's minds with, again, data and evidence. And it's not hugely removed from the work that I was doing before. Yes, the scope of the work is now within a private setting, but with these big companies, you're also raising the bar on policies, right? Like you can implement policies that will then, translate throughout the economy. I'm going to
Wonderful.
share Subodh. Thank you so much for this.
No, you have told us a very, very interesting set of facts and reports and analysis that an economist can do in the US. I think there are very few other countries where economists get to do what you do. In fact, I think there's no other country where economists can get to do what you do or what you did or what you are doing. I
Yeah,
doubt
very
that
lucky.
I think there's no other country in the world. So it's very unique, the American process that you have described so uh, clearly and explicitly, and how you had a role to play. I think it doesn't exist anywhere else, and I think it cannot exist anywhere else. So thank you for that. Uh, any advice you have for young people?
I've always believed that, I think in our hearts, we know what we like to do. And that's always been my guiding principle. And sometimes that means that, it's not always the most attractive and the most lucrative financially, opportunities that exist. But I think if you believe in what you want to do and you're willing to work hard and be aware, right? Like, I think a big part of, I see my son is in high school and, he has a lot of different passions, but I think it's also awareness about like the kind of work you're doing, Subodh, talking to different professionals. I do a lot of that mentoring for younger people because it's always an interesting journey. Like it's one thing to say, okay, I've been in this company and I've been there for 25 years, but I think it's also interesting to see the deviation and paths that people take. So talk to people widely, understand that where what you're interested in doing could lead, right? Like the typical path for an economist, people think is, oh, you're going to be a professor at a university. I think there are a zillion interesting things in this world to do as an economist, right? And you see a lot of people, I now meet a lot more economists in the private sector. I see a lot of people who are super happy in government. I see a lot of people who are obviously happy in academia or even unhappy in academia, right? And choosing different paths.
Right.
So you just, you talk to a variety of people and you realize the opportunities that exist. So, I would say don't limit yourself to like, this is the one thing that everyone's doing and I need to do it. Follow your interests, figure out what's the next step, figure out a path. I used to do a lot of note writing when I was a kid. Like, here's what I want to do. I wanted to be a teacher, when I was, I used to put all my toys and dolls in front of me and I would be like, I want to be a teacher. But a part of what I'm doing right now, I feel like is teaching, right? Like teaching myself to think about policy and teaching policy to others and teaching about, the research and so on. So be interested in the world around you, read widely, talk to people and figure out those alternative paths, right? There's no, in today's day and age, there's just like a zillion interesting things to do and explore in this world.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I think, shall we end it here now, or you have some last words you want to add?
No, I'm very happy. Thank you so much both for taking the time. I hope.
All right, time is not an issue. So let's end it here. I'll be back with another expert or a young person soon. And thank you so much. So let's say bye.
Thanks.
Okay, so let me end the recording here.